There is no such thing as a legislative agenda item that does not have a history. To understand at least the basic framework of that history is to comprehend, for example, how federal policy has affected people's lives, the health or lack thereof of our economy, and the development of institutions. And it makes no sense to repeal a law if we don't understand why that law was enacted. Nor does it make any sense to create new laws that address structures, behaviors, or processes whose evolution remains a mystery to us. To do either would be akin to a physician diagnosing a patient without first taking a medical history, and then perhaps even worse, performing surgery. The National History Center's Congressional Briefing Program aims to provide that history, that context. The program has been somewhat irregular, and we intend this year to move to a regular schedule that will probably include 4 briefings per year, each on a topic that is on the legislative agenda. Today, we will talk about immigration. Few Americans lack an opinion about immigration and immigrants. Today, we offer the policy community, however, an opportunity to hear 3 distinguished historians contribute to our understanding of the impact of earlier legislation and the historical context within which that legislation was enacted, so that as the Congress proceeds, they will have some context before they do their surgery. On behalf of Marion Barber, the Associate Director of the National History Center, and Roger Lewis, the Director of the National History Center, I want to thank everybody for attending. I want to especially thank the House Science, Space, and Technology Committee for hosting this event. Its chair, Congressman Lamar Smith of Texas, and his staff, Chris Schock and James Danford. We also are very grateful to Matt Wisniewski, the historian of the House of Representatives, and Don Ritchie, the historian of the Senate, for helping us understand how we might best conduct these events. And I also want to thank C-SPAN for televising, and to remind everybody that when they ask questions, they are going to be on television. So, first, turn off your cell phones, please. Second, a reminder that a few articles, because these are historians and they're not going to let you leave without some reading, a few articles are sitting on the table over there. We will have time for questions and answers after our panelists' presentations. I've asked each of our panelists to speak for 10 to 12 minutes and to offer their insights in a way that is nonpartisan. Our goal this morning is not to convince anyone of any particular position other than the position that to make change, one must understand how change has happened. So our speakers will speak in chronological order in terms of the story that they're going to tell. We will start with Tyler Anbinder, who is professor of history at George Washington University and has also taught at the University of Wyoming. Professor Anbinder has written 2 award-winning books, Nativism and Slavery, The Northern Know-Nothings and the Politics of the 1850s, and 5 points. I love it when people have titles that just really work. 5 points, the 19th century New York City neighborhood that invented tap dance, stole elections, and became the world's most notorious slum. He is currently working on a book called City of Dreams, New York's Immigrants and the Making of Modern America, and also has been a consultant to Martin Scorsese on the gangs of New York, so that you know that he can do more than write books. Alan Kraut is University Professor of History at American University and also teaches at the Uniformed University of the Health Sciences. You can ask him afterwards what that is. and has been a fellow at the Migration Policy Institute. I'm not going to list all 9 of his books, all of which focus on either immigration and ethnic history, the history of American medicine and public health, or both. These books include Silent Travelers, Germs, Genes, and the Immigrant Menace, and Huddled Masses, the Immigrant in American Society. His many articles focus on similar themes, but also on how immigration relates to food, baseball, and other important things. Professor Kraut has served as president of the Immigration and Ethnic History Society, and next week will become president of the Organization of American Historians. He chairs the Statue of Liberty Ellis Island Foundation's History Advisory Committee and has been a consultant to many documentary films, museum exhibitions, and the National Park Service. Mei Nai is professor of history and Lung Family Professor of Asian Studies at Columbia University and is also taught at the University of Chicago. She has won every fellowship that one can possibly imagine. And she is the author of Impossible Subjects, Illegal Aliens, and the Making of Modern America. Like our other guests, her books have won prizes. What's especially impressive about this one is that it's won prizes from 6 different organizations that focus on 6 different things. She's also the author of The Lucky Ones, One Family, and The Extraordinary Invention of Chinese America, which is about to be published both in Beijing and Taipei. Sort of get your mind around how someone pulls that off. She currently is working on a book comparing gold miners in Australia, South Africa, and western portions of North America, has had articles on immigration published in the New York Times, Washington Post, LA Times, and Chicago Tribune. Also is a member of the History Advisory Committee of the Statue of Liberty Ellis Island Foundation, and was on the New York Welcome Committee for Nelson Mandela's first visit to the United States. So, without further ado, I'm going to let our panelists, who know a lot more than I do, speak.
American immigration history is one of those fields that proves the validity of the old adage, the more things change, the more they remain the same. We tend to think of today's immigrants as totally different from those in our past. But while superficial differences certainly do exist, at the fundamental level, today's immigrants are in most ways no different than those who came to America in the period up to 1860, which is the one I've been asked to cover. In the brief time allotted to me this morning, I would like to focus on 4 such similarities. First, in every period of American history, there has been at least one immigrant group that is especially feared or vilified, and whose members were said to be fundamentally different and inferior to the immigrants who came before them. But before long, that group becomes widely accepted, and most Americans forget that they ever had an objection to them. Second, in every period of U.S. history, Americans have been conscious of, and in some cases wary of, the potential political power of immigrants. Since the days of George Washington, immigrant voting rights have been a partisan issue in which one party, the one that expected their votes, worked to ensure that immigrants could vote. Meanwhile, the party that did not enjoy the immigrants' favor would sometimes try to woo the immigrants, but more often do everything in its power to suppress their ability to cast ballots. Third, in nearly every period of American history, native-born Americans have badly mistaken the relationship between immigrants and poverty. And fourth, and finally, in every period of U.S. history, Americans have mistakenly believed that immigrants of their generation assimilated less than those of previous eras, and that the immigrants of their era would never become as American as older immigrants had. I will address each of these 4 issues for the period up through the end of the American Civil War, and end with brief observations about what these facts may tell us about the current debate on how to overhaul our immigration laws. The immigrant group that received the most attention in the years before the Civil War was the Irish. In almost every year from 1820 to 1860, more immigrants came from Ireland than from any other place. The Irish thus became the most numerous and the most visible immigrant group in America. To give you some context, today, Mexican immigrants make up 29% of the U.S. immigrant population. In 1850, the Irish made up 43% of American immigrants. The Irish came to the U.S. fleeing both persistent poverty and political oppression, and arrived in the largest numbers during the Great Potato Famine of 1846 to 51. The United States in the pre-Civil War years was also home to huge numbers of German immigrants. They were less impoverished than the Irish. A significant number proceeded directly to the Midwest and bought farms. But even more settled in Kleindeutschlands, little Germanys in New York, Buffalo, Cincinnati, Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Louis, among other cities. Most of the remaining immigrants living in the U.S. in 1860 came from England, Scotland, Wales, and Canada. These four places, plus Ireland and the German states, accounted for 90% of the immigrants in the United States in 1860. Many Americans in 1860 believed that the Irish could never be true Americans. These critics believed that Protestantism was what made America prosperous, free, and democratic, while the Irish were mostly Catholics who supposedly did not understand these values. Germans also came in for condemnation, albeit a bit less often than the Irish. Native-born Americans complained that the Germans were godless, prone to socialism, and resistant to learning English. Germans in many states succeeded in convincing schools to instruct their children in German, annoying natives who believed that English should be the only language used in the public schools. But a generation later, even though immigrants from Ireland and Germany continued to pour into the United States, these complaints about the Irish and Germans had been largely forgotten, as the immigrants from both places had become solidly middle class and seemed desirable compared to other groups. So my second subject is immigrants and politics. Americans have always looked at immigrants as potential voters. Many states and localities in the 19th century allowed immigrants to vote even before they became citizens. At times in this period, parties tried to roll back immigrants' political rights. In 1798, Federalists increased the waiting period before an immigrant could vote from 5 to 14 years because Federalists believed that most immigrants voted for their enemies, the Republicans. When Republicans gained control of Congress after the elections of 1800, they repealed this extended waiting period. In the 1850s, when most immigrants voted Democratic, Republicans were divided over what to do. Massachusetts Republicans' response to the immigrants' preference for Democrats was to add 2 extra years to the waiting period before immigrants could vote in that state. But other Republicans insisted that the party should try to win immigrant votes rather than suppress them. Abraham Lincoln was one of the leading advocates of this stance, and the party's 1860 platform reflected his views. Third subject I want to look at is immigrants and poverty. The Irish were condemned as importers of poverty. Critics of immigration believed that the poorest of Europe's poor dominated the immigration to the United States. In fact, the poorest Irish peasants could not afford to emigrate. It cost a lot of money to cross the Atlantic in those days, even in steerage, and you had to bring a month's supply of food and water with you. So in most cases, only those with resources could make the trip. Furthermore, immigrants were not as poor as natives thought. Because the immigrants dressed so shabbily and lived in overcrowded apartments in the nation's most decrepit neighborhoods, natives assumed that the immigrants were penniless. But a look at the famine immigrants' bank accounts reveals that they saved a lot more money than their material possessions would suggest. This is because the immigrants did not indulge in the material comforts that natives took for granted. They shared bedrooms with boarders and worked multiple jobs, thereby saving every possible penny so that they could send remittances to Ireland to support aged parents or pay for the immigration of loved ones or start their own businesses. This is a situation very similar to what we have today. Most of today's new arrivals are not the poorest of the world's poor because the most destitute do not have the bank balances to qualify for visas. And most new immigrants who do make it to America are fanatical savers who share crowded living spaces and work multiple jobs in order to support loved ones back home or to save to buy a home or a business. Final subject I want to look at is assimilation. Americans have always believed that their immigrant forebears assimilated more than the immigrants of their generation. But if we use the term assimilate the way native-born Americans do, then no adult immigrants of any era have really assimilated much. Most adult immigrants try to continue to speak their native tongues, socialize primarily with their compatriots, sing the same songs and play the same games as they had back home, eat much the same food, and complain that American values are ruining their children. The process of assimilation for immigrants a century ago was not, to be sure, identical to that undergone today. But in the end, those differences are largely, I think, superficial. What it means, what it feels like to uproot oneself and begin life all over again in a strange, new place has not changed much from the 19th century to today. So what do these facts tell us about the current debate over overhauling our immigration laws? I think there are three main lessons to take. The first is that the fear of today's immigrants will pass. It's passed for every previous generation of American immigrants, and history as a guide would tell us that it's going to pass for this generation of immigrants too. Second, immigrants today are not as poor as they seem. We can use the historical record to see that immigrants from the past who were perceived to be penniless in fact had significant savings, sometimes brought with them, sometimes earned very quickly upon coming to America. So there's no reason to believe that today's immigrants who seem impoverished are not in fact actually saving large sums or sending large amounts of money to loved ones in their homelands as well. And third and finally, immigrants' level of assimilation today, which is worrisome to many Americans, is really nothing new. The amount of assimilation that goes on with immigrants today is about the same as it's always been for American immigrants. So what I find is that today's immigrants are simply the latest chapter in the never-ending story of the making of America. Thank you.
On the 50th anniversary of the publication of President John F. Kennedy's volume, A Nation of Immigrants, in 1958, Senator Ted Kennedy recalled that in July 1963, his brother was pushing hard for immigration reform and told Congress, quote, "The enactment of this legislation will not resolve all of our important problems in the field of immigration law. It will, however, provide a sound basis upon which we can build in developing an immigration law that serves the national interest and reflects in every detail the principles of equality and human dignity to which our nation subscribes," end quote. The President did not live to see immigration reform enacted, and perhaps he would not have been delighted with all that flowed from the bill eventually passed in 1965. But he was quite certain that the American government's relationship to immigration demanded change from the restrictive and very racist laws of an earlier era. In the 1870s, immigration was still largely a state matter. At depots such as Castle Garden in New York, state officials interrogated and inspected newcomers. However, in that same decade, federal legislation was passed to bar convicts and prostitutes. And in 1882, federal law also excluded beggars, paupers, epileptics, the mentally ill, and those with tuberculosis, the developmentally disabled, and those who might be unable to support themselves and become public charges. And since the federal government did not have the bureaucratic mechanism to handle all of those tasks, the states were still very, very much involved. But another law passed in 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Law, responded to the racial and economic anxieties of white Americans, especially those in California. Led by Irish-born Dennis Carney and his Working Men's Party, the anti-Chinese movement in California blamed the Chinese for white unemployment. Often, it appropriated the vilest racial stereotypes and waxed violent. Everyone had a bad word to say about the Chinese. Even the African-American newspapers called for the exclusion of the Chinese on the grounds that their labor for low wages hurt African-American workers. More than any previous legislation, the Chinese Exclusion Act used the power of the federal government to define demographic and cultural characteristics of this nation. Now, the act did not bar all Chinese, just laborers, but merchants, students, the immediate family of American-born Chinese citizens, and Chinese-American citizens returning from abroad were not barred. But those who were returning's reentry was often made very difficult by federal officials. It was a time when the federal government was really involved in shaping the American population in response to the prejudices of that population. And, of course, the economic issue was never absent. Not long after the concern about foreign labor in 1885, there was the Contract Labor Act to keep those who had made prior agreements with American corporations and manufacturers out of the United States. And so there was this balance between economic fears and racial and cultural fears, which was very much the underpinning of American legislation in this period. In addition to legislation, there were special agreements. In order to curb Japanese migration to the United States, President Theodore Roosevelt negotiated an agreement with the Japanese government, the so-called Gentleman's Agreement of 1907, a quota system that slashed approximately 72,000 arrivals from Japan per year by a third. Because Hawaiian growers needed workers on the sugar plantations, the islands acquired by the United States in 1898 were exempt from the agreement. So once again, you can see how economic priorities played a role. 9 western states and Florida acted to prevent those ineligible for citizenship to own land in those states. And when Japanese bought land, they often bought land in their children's name because their children, if born here, were citizens of the United States. So again, this pattern of racial discrimination and its interaction with economic concerns is very much in evidence. After the severe economic depression of the 1890s, the flow of immigration to the United States reached unprecedented proportions. Between 1871 and 1900, 11.7 million immigrants arrived. Between 1901 and 1920, 14.5 million more came to this country. It was a period of tremendous movement of peoples around the globe. On the East Coast, most of the arrivals still originated largely from Northern and Western Europe, but a gradual shift to Southern and Eastern Europe accelerated in the 1890s. Between roughly 1890 and 1914, millions of Southern Italian Catholics, Eastern European Jews, Russians, Greeks, Slavs arrived in this country. At the same time, Canadians were moving south, Mexicans back and forth across America's borders, nor was the United States the only host nation. Argentina, Brazil, New Zealand, South Africa also attracted millions of newcomers. It was a time when Americans' interest and concern with immigrants was never higher. Lacking confidence in the states to handle the interrogation and the medical examination of immigrants, because in the light of germ theory, we were now on a hunt for germs among the newcomers, Congress in 1891 established a Bureau of Immigration to curb inefficiency and regularize immigration procedures. Immigration officers and physicians of the U.S. Marine Hospital Service were stationed at immigration depots that are familiar names perhaps to you now as museums. Ellis Island in New York Harbor was one of those places where the interrogation took place and the examination for illnesses, and also Angel Island on the West Coast in San Francisco Bay, thank you, where immigrants coming from Asia were examined as well. And so the idea was to have a labor force that was healthy, that was robust, that would be disciplined, or there would be an ability to discipline this labor force for the benefit of the United States. There was an immigrant saying translated into many languages: America beckons, but Americans repel. Even as the United States craved foreign-born labor for factories and mines, nativists actively made newcomers feel unwelcome. Opponents of immigration feared job competition for American workers, but also they were concerned that culturally, and yes, even biologically, the newcomers could not become integrated into the American population. The concern, of course, was undergirded by eugenics, the science of the perfectibility of humankind, and on that scale, the newcomers were decidedly in an inferior position. One sociologist, I'm glad it wasn't a historian, but a sociologist named E.A. Ross wrote the following in 1914. In this sense, it is fair to say that the blood now being injected into the veins of our people is subcommon. To one accustomed to the aspect of the normal American population, the Caliban type shows up with a frequency that is startling. Observe immigrants, not as they come travel-wan up the gangplank, nor as they issue toil-begrimed from Pittsmouth or Millgate, but in their gatherings, washed, combed, and in their Sunday best. You are struck by the fact that from 10 to 20% are hirsute, low-browed, big-faced persons of obviously low mentality. Not that they suggest evil, they simply look out of place in black clothes and stiff collar, since clearly they belong in skins in wattled huts at the close of the Great Ice Age. It goes on and on. And so by 1911, Congress decided to study the matter and concluded that while immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe were often law-abiding and industrious, the racial differences between Jews, Southern Italians, Greeks, and Anglo-Saxons and Teutonic types made restriction a pretty good idea. Some favored a literacy test, which Congress passed in 1917, but Congress also recommended the development of further restrictions based on numerical formulas. And during World War I, the U.S. government appealed to new immigrants to serve in the armed forces, to be patriotic, and at the same time, Congress was preparing massive restriction. And after the war, in 1921, Congress passed the Emergency Quota Act, keeping the ban on Asians and imposing for 3 years a quota system that limited European immigration to 3% per year for individual groups based on their presence in the population, according to the 1910 federal census. It limited the entrance to 350,000 a year, 45% from Southern and Eastern Europe, but 55% from the traditional sources and Northern and Western Europe. There was no question that the goal of this legislation was to maintain a racial balance in the United States and to exclude the Southern Italians and Eastern European Jews, who were often looked upon in racialized terms as people of different races, and therefore not eligible to come to this country. There was also talk, though it was not actually fully institutionalized, of a commission, not unlike the one currently being discussed among policymakers, to decide what the economic needs of the United States might be and to adjust very carefully the percentage of immigrants allowed every year to fulfill the needs of the economy. But that was not quite restrictive enough. And so in 1924, the Johnson-Reed Act limited to 150,000 annually from the entire globe, exclusive of the Western Hemisphere. And we attempted to maintain our goodwill with Canada and to ensure adequate Mexican agricultural labor. We allowed pretty much the free flow across our borders. The new quota was apportioned according to the 1890 census, before most Southern and Eastern Europeans had arrived, and therefore taking a percentage, in this case 2%, of those already in the United States would push down still further the numbers of those groups coming to the United States now in this period. A commission was established, negotiations were held. It took all the way from 1924 until 1929 for the law to be fully operable. Of course, by 1929, something else was going on. and that, of course, was the descent of depression, the stock market crash in 1929, and yet further calls for restricting immigration. The arrival of Franklin Roosevelt in the White House did not change the system. Roosevelt's main priority was to end the Depression, and after 1941 to win the war in Europe. Other priorities, including the rescue of populations, the fiddling with immigration law, was not part of his portfolio as he saw it at that point. Even the plight of European Jewry, FDR saw as a human tragedy, but not one that he wanted to intervene to do something about, even in terms of encouraging the State Department to admit more refugees. And so between the 1870s and the 1930s, Congress did in fact transform immigration policy from a state-centered system to a federal system that controlled and prioritized potential admittees based largely on racialized conceptions and labor needs. Nor was the U.S. alone. Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Canada were doing the same thing. The Japanese, imbued with their own sense of racial superiority, banned Chinese and Korean immigration. With the exception of skilled workers, Canada dropped all immigration except migrants from France and the UK, homelands of Canada's original European settlers. On the eve of World War II, preparing to battle the Nazis and the Japanese, two societies steeped in racial ideology, the United States had an immigration system firmly based on a racialized hierarchy of our own, undergirded by federal law. Self-consciously, celebratorily, a nation of nations, we were also a country whose increasing restrictive immigration policies reflected a deep, a profound commitment to racial definitions and prejudices and our own economic well-being, of course. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, and my apologies, I don't have any slides for you. All right, so I'm going to pick up where Professor Kraut left off. After World War II, the racial dimensions that had been enacted in the previous period, the national origin quotas and Asian exclusion, these begin to seem outdated to Americans, remnants of what one historian called outworn prejudices, and obviously these are coming under pressure from international and domestic trends. The influence of anti-fascism and anti-racism from the war, a coming of age of the second generation of European immigrants who came in the early 20th century. These become important voting constituencies in the urban industrial north. So for the second generation of European American ethnics, immigration reform is their civil rights movement in the post-war period. There's also the emergence of the United States as a world leader from the war and the advent of the Cold War, which makes the origins quotas and Asian exclusion an embarrassment to the United States. So from World War II through 1952, you see the gradual repeal of all the increments of Asian exclusion. Although it's tricky because even though Asians are no longer completely excluded, there are global racial quotas that are set up. So it's really done a lot for foreign policy purposes. Congress still is wary about letting too many Asians in. And the final change, I think, in the post-war period is the United States begins to admit refugees into the country. This is also done incrementally in an ad hoc way because there is no special legislation for refugees until 1980. So there are ad hoc admissions, mostly from people fleeing communism. There's Hungarian, Cuban, and later Indo-Chinese legislation. What doesn't change from the 1924 Act in the post-war period are two important things, and these things carry through to today. First, the commitment to numerical restrictions, right? Until 1924, we basically had an open door. Americans remain committed to the idea that there should be a set limit on the number of people who come into the country. The other thing that doesn't really change from the previous period is an ambivalence towards Mexican immigration. Although Mexicans had no numerical quotas in the 24 Act, that was a function of State Department policy and commercial agriculture's interests. There were administrative restrictions put in place in 1929. So why not allow open labor migration as in the early 20th century? Why is there still this concern about Mexicans? The easy answer, I think the two easy answers, is that it was a racial bias, but as we saw, there were plenty of racial biases towards immigrants at the turn of the century. I think that's part of the picture, but there's also changes in the economy where industry and manufacturing no longer needed the levels of mass immigration that had supported it at the turn of the century. And I think there's unclarity, if not confusion, about agricultural needs, which is what Mexicans were mostly supplying. During World War II, the United States started an agricultural guest worker program with Mexico, commonly known as the Bracero program, initially to address labor shortages during the war in railroad maintenance and agriculture. But that program was extended and lasted until 1964 as a way to bring in low-skilled, low-paid agricultural workers for intensive agricultural work in the West and Southwest. At its height, over 400,000 a year, and by the early 60s, still bringing in 200,000 people a year. There are two major lessons, I think, from the Bracero program that are important to think about as these issues are considered today. First, that there was a lot of energy put into the contracts that the guest workers signed to protect them from abuse, low wages and other kinds of abuse. These contracts turned out to be virtually worthless because there was very weak enforcement mechanisms in place, but perhaps even more importantly of the ultimate power of that the growers had to send back workers that protested their treatment. So as long as employers could deport unhappy workers, the contracts were really very limited in meaning. Second, contrary to expectation and belief, the guest worker programs did not eliminate unlawful entries. In fact, they actually were a magnet for a parallel stream of undocumented migration. For many growers near the border, it was easier for them, they said, to recruit undocumented labor. And in fact, the supply and demand of the labor market exceeded the number of legal spots that were available, which is, I think, a general pattern, not just limited to guest workers. And related to this, many agricultural workers simply skipped or walked out on their contracts. If they didn't like the way they were treated, they went and found a job somewhere else. And many of them remained in the United States, living and working in the shadows, as we now like to say. But many also became regularized, eventually under rules in the 1952 Immigration Act that allowed for suspension of deportation if you lived in the country for 7 years and married an American or had American-born children. The Bracero program ended in 1964 because of public outcry against the abuses that were in the system, and also with the mechanization of cotton and tomatoes, there was less need for that. In 1965, the Hart-Celler Act was passed. This is the major immigration legislation that now serves as the foundation of current policy. The Hart-Celler eliminated the national origin quota system, and it was very much a piece of the civil rights legislation of 1964 and 65, the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. It was a triumph of reform that was spearheaded by the European American ethnics and their allies, especially American Jews, Italian Americans, organized labor, and the churches. At the same time, the commitment to global numerical restriction remained. The ceiling that was set in place in 1924, which was 150,000, was raised to 290,000, which was really the same as the 1924 ceiling, simply adjusted for population increase. Actually, it was more restrictive than the earlier law because now it included the entire globe. In 1924, the Western Hemisphere had been exempted. And it's striking in light of the fact that in the mid-60s we had an expanding economy and a declining birth rate. Okay, so there was commitment to overturn the national origin quotas, which were patently discriminatory for racial reasons, but what would be a better way to allocate the quotas? The bill that passed, sponsored by Hart and Seller, which were bills sponsored by first the Kennedy administration and then the Johnson administration, created a system based on family and occupational preferences, with all countries having the same maximum limit of 7% of the total, which was 20,000 at the time. This formula reflected a civil rights ethos of formal equality, that is, we should treat all countries in the same manner. At the same time, the bill set aside 3% of the total for refugees. Now, Phil Hart, the senator from Michigan, who was the co-sponsor of the legislation, actually had his own bills that he sponsored in the Senate in 1961 and 62. These were quite different, and my research revealed that there was some strong-arming that took place from the Kennedy White House that pressured Hart into sponsoring the Kennedy bill. But Phil Hart's bills are interesting, and I have a piece that I published in the New York Times earlier this year that goes into some detail about it if you're interested. But basically he proposed a proportional distribution system according to the size of population of the sending country, which is a kind of proxy for need, and according to emigration to the United States in the previous 15 years, which recognizes community and family ties. And he also set aside 20% of the total for refugees. Now, this was a complicated system, but in many ways it was much more thoughtful than this one-size-fits-all policy, which I think in a sense, because of its simplicity, won the day. Both the Hart bills and the original administration bills left the Western Hemisphere outside of the quota system, right? They intended to continue a policy of Pan-Americanism. But that exemption fell under pressure at the last minute. This is a great story of last-minute behind-the-scenes negotiations when a bill is getting through the process. Senators Dirksen and Ervin held the national origin repeal hostage to the Western Hemisphere quota. In other words, they said if you want to repeal the national origin systems, you're going to have to put quotas on the Western Hemisphere. And their reasons were, one, what they said was an impending population explosion in Latin America, and secondly, that it would be unfair to impose quotas on the rest of the world and not the Western Hemisphere. Now, the Hart-Celler Act has been called the law of unintended consequences, and in the sense that it was not meant to lead to greater immigration from Asia and Latin America, and in fact, that's what it did. In fact, Hart-Celler was a reform for much greater inclusivity of Europeans and Asians, but it was a more restrictive and regressive bill for Mexico and Latin America because of the new imposition of numerical quotas. There were modest increases in European immigration. Italians used the new opportunities to bring over adult siblings and parents, but Europe also has a falling birth rate in this period, is no longer really a major sending region of immigrants. As we all know, there was a vast increase in Asian immigration. At first, Asians used the employment preferences because there was no population of Asians in the United States, and then once people came in as professionals or technical workers, they then used the family preferences. And this accounts for the lopsided distribution to the upper middle class of Asians in this country. Policy, not culture, explains the model minority phenomenon. The deal made to impose the quota on the Western Hemisphere was one where it was done to get the bill passed, but everybody knew that would put pressure on Mexican migration. In the early 60s, if you include the Bracero program, Mexican immigration was about 200,000 a year. How are you going to get that number down to 20,000? When they passed the law, they set up a select congressional commission to study the matter because they knew it would be problematic. That commission advocated against a numerical quota for the Western Hemisphere countries in favor of administrative regulation, but their recommendations did not prevail. The country quotas were phased in, and applied in full in 1976, and almost immediately we have then the problem of mass unlawful migration. By early 1980, this had accreted to a population of several million, and we had a fantastic rhetoric then about the border being out of control. In the late 70s and 80s, we see important changes in the law. One is in legal thinking, and in some great measure a result of the beginnings of greater political voice from the Latino community. And that is there's some moderation in how the undocumented are treated. There are administrative rulings in the INS and case law that define, for example, how far one can be from the border to be stopped without a warrant. There are more procedural due process in deportation proceedings, and there's a balance of equities test that is applied in suspension of deportation cases. Much of this was wiped out in 1996. And then, as you all know, in 1986, Congress passed the IRCA, the Immigration Reform and Control Act, which was signed by President Reagan, which created the structure that remains in place today for how we think about immigration reform. What we call comprehensive immigration reform comes out of the IRCA experience. And this is basically a formula that says we will try to solve the problem of illegal immigration by legalizing those who are already here and putting in place mechanisms to prevent any future unlawful immigration. As we know, that didn't quite work out, and there's a lot of discussion as to why that is, that IRCA was too idealistic, it was too lenient. In fact, the reason why we continue to have unlawful migration is because the system that was put in place under Hart-Celler, which has the same maximum for every country, right, 20,000, what that means is that Belgium has the same quota as Mexico, right? It means that New Zealand has the same quota as India, right? So when people talk about there being long lines for visas, there are 4 countries that max out on their visas every year, only 4, and it's the same 4 every year: Mexico, India, China, and the Philippines. So when people say you should go to the back of the line, that line for some countries is 20 to 40 years long. In 1990, Congress raised the overall ceiling on migration by 40%. Now that's a lot, and that was in response to the economic expansion of the time. But because every country gets the same 7% limit, the 20,000 limit went up to 25,600, right? So 40% increase in the overall ceiling meant for a country like Mexico or India really a very small increase. And you still have the same problem then of visa backlogs and unlawful entries. I'm going to end by just saying a few words about the most recent period of economic expansion and recent recession and how it's affected immigration. One is, I think, that the economic restructuring that took place at the end of the 20th century, which continued to draw migration, also fed anti-immigrant sentiment. You had a decline in the manufacturing industries and growth in the service sector, so that native whites and native blacks suffered greater unemployment. And it was the new sectors in the service economy, as well as agriculture and agricultural processing, that drew low-wage immigrant labor. The same period saw a declining strength in organized labor and a shift to subcontracting in many industries to get away from unions, which then hired low-wage immigrants. Another feature of this economic restructuring was a reversal in the trend of distribution of wealth. Right, from 1947 to 1974, we had a steady trajectory of a declining gap between the wealthiest and poorest in the United States. Since 1974, we have seen a steady increase in wealth inequality. That, combined with the reduction in social welfare provisions and anti-tax movements, have put increased pressure on state and local budgets and the middle class especially. The 1996 immigration laws were a response to the anti-immigrant sentiment that had arisen in this era, mostly as a response to these anxieties. And these laws were particularly harsh and punitive, with mandatory removal for relatively minor offenses and a growth of a private detention industry. And I will just say that these are things that appear not to be really under consideration in the current round of discussion on immigration reform. And finally, I will say that nativism, I think, has been fed by a new kind, as my colleagues have pointed out, the new group of choice now for nativist attack are Latinos. Much of this is, some of this is open, but much of this is done under the rubric of concern of the illegals. And while Mexicans do make up a large percentage of the unlawful immigrant population, not all Mexicans are illegal. A third of the foreign-born are naturalized citizens, in fact. And we don't really hear the same kind of talk about unlawful immigration among other groups that have high proportions of unauthorized migration, such as Polish or Irish, not to single anybody out. So I will end there and hope that this gives you some background on the structures that we're now dealing with in today's debates. Thank you.
It seems to me that one of the assumptions being made here is what Donna Gabacha calls the Ellis Island paradigm. That is the assumption that everybody who comes here wants to stay, wants to settle permanently. For the different periods, I wonder to what extent you think that is true. And second, given the fact that the U.S. is a civic society and citizenship is based on having been born here, but not necessarily on a single ethnic group, and I think both Alan and May pointed out the economic and racial motivations that seem to underlie immigration policy, or have underlaid it for a long time. In an ideal world, if you had your druthers, what should be the criteria for immigration? And should there be a ceiling, what should it be?
Well, why don't I start with the first question, and then maybe I'll let you guys answer the second question. One significant difference between immigrants in the period I just covered up to 1860 and the period that Alan and May covered is that almost all the immigrants who came to the United States up through the Civil War period intended to stay permanently. The Irish feeling that their nation under colonial rule was just not a place that they could make a good living. Germans, for various reasons, saw the United States as a new permanent home also. And so in the period I covered, immigrants saw the United States as a permanent home. That, of course, changes in the later period when lots of people, starting with Italians and Chinese and others, imagine coming to the United States, making some money, and going back with that money to their homeland. As far as what the law ought to be, I think I'll let Alan and May deal with that one.
Yeah.
I can just add to this question of permanent settlement. I think both the two big mass labor migrations at the end of the 19th century, end of the 20th, many people don't intend to stay. The difference is that at the turn of the 20th century, you could decide what you wanted to do within the constraints of your own family's interests and your community, but it was an individual choice because you could come and you could go, or you could stay. Now, not everybody can come, and one of the ironies of the late 90s and the last 15 years of border control and the militarization of the border is that more undocumented workers decided to stay, whereas they had gone back and forth before, even risking crossing the border unlawfully. It was much easier to do. So we get to the figure of 11, 12 million because raising the border meant actually more people stayed.
And Sonia, I would also want to remind you that our goal in these briefings is not to tell Congress what to do, but rather to provide them with the historical context that's useful to them to decide what to do themselves.
Yeah, let me weigh in on this a little bit. Historians often use the term transnationalism to describe the phenomenon of people participating in two societies, two political systems, sometimes two economic systems at the same time. This is not new. Southern Italian laborers at the turn of the century were a seasonal labor migration. And they did participate in two societies at the same time, and they participated in the politics of their home society and in the politics of the United States and in the economies and so on. What's different now is the speed with which that can take place and the facility with which that can take place. Sometimes you can vote in two societies at the same time. That did not used to be the case. The New York Times reported one day a story of a Dominican man living on the Upper East Side of Manhattan who went out to the airport, flew down to the Dominican Republic, did business, had lunch, saw relatives, and got back into Manhattan in time for a very late supper. That's extraordinary, isn't it? The speed with which you can participate at the same time is enormous. And so you don't have to consider working for a while and going home. You can rather consider doing two things at the same time. In the period that I covered in my talk, Eastern European Jews had no intention of going back to Russia, especially after the pogroms of 1900. There was nothing to go back to except death and destruction. But that was not true for Southern Italian laborers. It was not true for many Poles who hoped to work, save, and then go back. And so the expectations were completely different. I think we're dealing in a world, in this world of transnationalism, in this world of rapid transportation and communication, that's made it a very, very different kind of environment to think about.
Can I reframe my question?
Well, unless there are no others, because
Let
we
me,
don't
let me just give a nonpartisan answer to Sonia's question. I think that we tend to believe that that the law increasingly over time has put territoriality at the forefront, right? Meaning control over the national space. So the border is the most important thing in people's minds today. And that was not always the case, right? There are many elements that went into how the government looked at migration. For economic needs, certainly, for families as a refuge from persecution. There are all kinds of reasons. And even when we had border policies starting in 1924, we had different policies for different borders. There was one of restriction for Europe, exclusion for Asia, and a very curious policy for Mexico, which was open formally, very easy to cross, but only without papers. Right, so we've also had different kinds of border policies even concurrently. So there's this idea today that you have to have one single border policy that trumps everything else, and historically that has not been the case.
And I think what historians can contribute there to the process, again, is less telling Congress what to do than to provide a sense of how thinking historically gives us a better sense of the range of options available when we have a better understanding of the larger variety of things we've done in the past than most people think. Yeah.
Max Friedman, American University. I'd like to connect. Max Friedman, American University. I'd like to connect a couple of the comments that have been made so far from the beginning, where Professor Anbinder mentioned that there's not been much change in the level of assimilation, and Americans fear that assimilation would not take place. And yet this way in which we've seen the rapid acceleration of the phenomenon of circular migration with people returning home. And if we add to that the globalization of media and the ability to sustain a culture beyond the first generation and so forth, how would you then, how would the panel address concerns that one hears, for example, from, let's say, legislators from the Southwest who say we are in a different era, the acceleration of cultural exchange and of physical movement means that maybe, okay, we were wrong about the Irish and the Germans being unassimilable, but maybe we are looking at a different pattern in which there's going to be a slower rate of acculturation among immigrants who are able to move more rapidly and stay in closer touch with their sending communities.
I'll respond to that because you know, Samuel Huntington at Harvard was one of the scholars in his book, Who Are We?, who was very concerned about the Mexicans and their ability to assimilate or not to assimilate. And I said to him then, and I still believe that Mexicans, like every other group, will assimilate. Other groups took different lengths of time to become Americanized, as we say, to respond to American culture, to speak English, and so on. I think that that will be true with these current groups as well. I think also that we have never had in this country immigrant policy. We have immigration policy, but we have never involved the federal government in the incorporation of immigrants into the society. The federal government has not paid for language lessons, for example. It has been the responsibility of the states and private organizations and so on. And I think, frankly, that the time has come for the United States as a government to think through that issue of how it can facilitate, for those who want it, assistance in the process of incorporation, to relieve the financial burden of states and private agencies, and to facilitate the process a little bit more than it has in the past. Again, nothing overbearing, nothing, harsh requirements, but rather support through resources for doing that. And I think that, that's certainly one of the things that history tells us, is that it's an issue of, once you have all of these folks who've come to the United States, how do you make them feel at home? How do you integrate them? And they do integrate. Whether it's because the television programs in English are better on TV, whether it's because the little kids see their friends on the playground and talk to them in English, it happens. It always has happened, and I have no doubt it's happening right now, even as we speak.
Well, in fact, there are a lot of social science data that show the same pattern of assimilation. As Talia said, the first generation doesn't learn much English. The second generation, they all know English. For Mexicans, in fact, that's not only true, but in the third generation, you have a much higher level of outmarriage than in previous immigrant groups. So what you have that's different is actually you have a different problem, which is economic stagnation and lower rates of mobility upward. And that has, so that doesn't correlate to assimilation because they are assimilating, but it does, I think, point to a difference in the economic situation today, where you have things like crumbling urban public education system, a difference in the kinds of jobs that are available for people with only a high school education is much different than it was 50 years ago. And you have a real difference in, what really helped the second and third generation of European ethnics after World War II was the GI Bill, right? You could buy a house and go to college. So there are a lot of things that sped the incorporation of Europeans that you don't have today.
Okay, we are running out of time. I would like to, was there any more? We have time for one more? Yeah.
I was curious whether you would be willing to speak to the relationship between immigration and civic engagement and citizenship. How does that sort of relationship between civic engagement and citizenship throughout history kind of play out in the modern day? I mean, how their ideas of immigration reform should kind of incorporate ideas of citizenship, and whether this leads to an establishment of guest worker program or things like that.
Nice small question.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Can I take a stab at that one? I think one of the interesting things about your question is that what you find, at least what I found, is that people's views on, people tend to use the civic engagement issue as a way to support their argument no matter what the civic engagement of immigrants is. So what you find in the pre-Civil War period is Americans complain that the Irish were too politically active, and that was a reason to prevent them from becoming citizens as quickly as they were. Then when you get to the late 19th, early 20th century, one of the complaints about, say, Italian immigrants was that they were not politically active, and that showed that they weren't engaged enough to be citizens. And now today, you kind of swung back the other way, and Latino immigrant participation in voting is a big issue in terms of, is this helping one party or hurting another? So I think what you tend to find in the debate about this is that people use that more to try to put across a preconceived point of view than to really use it to make policy.
Yeah. Also, there's lots of different kinds of civic engagement. I mean, you've been talking about the ballot, and certainly that's important. And many of us believe, as I do, that paths to citizenship are critical, and traditional political engagement is terribly important as a sign of civic engagement. But it's not the only kind. The armed services, especially in the era of selective service, was a very important aspect of civic engagement. Anybody who watches the old World War II movies or reads, Norman Mailer's The Naked and the Dead, know that in every platoon there was an Irishman, there was a Jew, there was an Italian. And this, too, is a kind of civic engagement that we often ignore. Engagement in the military, service of many, many different kinds, inclusion in community organizations, the massing together for common purpose and volunteerism in self-help. So there's lots of different kinds of engagement, and my argument would be, in spite of the fact that this is a volunteer army, volunteer army, you do see many, many newly arrived immigrants and their children engaged in volunteering and in that form of civic engagement in the military. And in many other aspects as well. I think when you live in a country for a period of time, you see it in your own best interests to engage. It's something that happens.
Let me just say something very brief to turn the question upside down, perhaps. What should we expect from people in this country? What should we as a society and as a government expect? Now, citizenship in the United States has always rested on an idea of productive labor. Right? A good citizen was always one who worked. Sometimes we're a little extreme about that, but going back to the very founding of the Republic, the Jeffersonian idea, right, of independent and productive labor was a core of virtue and citizenship.
The myth of John Smith.
Exactly. So, and that has held true. Now, whether or not people naturalize or become good citizens is another question, but our concept of citizenship in this country has rested on an idea of republicanism, which, you could say drills down to a question of labor. And now, since World War II, since we've had these numerical restrictions, and we need labor, now we have these exceptions, right, to that philosophy, which is that, we can invite you here to work, but we're not going to let you be a citizen. And I think that should give people great pause in thinking about what kind of society and what we think citizenship is its real meaning is about.
I think that's probably a good note to end. So thank you all very much for attending. There is some reading by the door. Again, as with three professors up here, I would be remiss in not reminding you that there is reading to do.
It's a take-home exam.
That's right. Thank you very much.